Throughout the years, we've watched the anime industry completely redefine the limits of visual storytelling. We're at a point where the sheer, painstaking artistry on display in an average seasonal show completely eclipses what used to be considered movie-quality animation just a decade ago. But despite this massive, undeniable evolution in how these stories look, there's one specific aspect of the medium that still feels like it's stuck in the past. Because for whatever reason, no matter how breathtaking the visuals get, anime scripts are still absolutely terrible. Western animation is so much ahead when it comes to dialogue that you can't help but wonder, why do most anime follow the same exhausting generic blueprint? It's an industry built almost entirely on adapting weekly manga, which means the scripts are inherently chained to a medium that literally has to rely on massive text bubbles and internal monologues just to make sure the reader understands what's happening. But the problem is, when you directly translate that exact same script into a fluid, beautifully animated visual medium, those massive text bubbles just feel completely unnecessary. Today, we're going to be looking at some examples of terrible dialogue in anime, and I'll present some examples from other forms of media that actually get it right. There's a foundational rule in screenwriting when it comes to introducing two characters who already share a complicated history. It relies on the idea that real people don't go around explicitly reminding each other of their biological or social parameters. If two characters have known each other for a decade, a good writer isn't going to have them recite their relationship status out loud. They're going to drop you right into the middle of their messy, lived-in dynamic and force you to infer who they are to each other based strictly on the tension in the room and the conversation they have. But if you've watched enough mainstream anime, you already know that the industry is absolutely terrified of letting you figure anything out for yourself. There are many problems in anime where dialogue is concerned, and the first one of them is that a lot of the time in anime, they won't let us figure things out on our own. This artificiality doesn't just ruin cultural realism, it completely destroys how characters are introduced. It assumes that if the audience doesn't know the exact DNA sequence, backstory, and social dynamic of a character within 5 seconds of them appearing on screen, they'll change the channel. So, when two characters with a shared history interact, the anime will literally pause the scene so the protagonist can hand the audience a relational dossier via internal monologue. This is my childhood friend, we've known each other for 10 years, her parents own a bakery, etc. In the first season of Better Call Saul, Mike is pushing a little girl on a swing while talking to a younger woman. The show gives us zero narration and no title cards, but the dialogue gives us breadcrumbs. Mike calls himself Pop Pop, he asks how Kaylee is doing while the camera angle cleverly changes to put the little girl in the foreground. The woman mournfully mentions that Kaylee still asks where her dad is and talks about how her husband Maddie acted strangely right before he died. Finally, Mike apologizes for taking so long to move out west, promising he is here for the duration. The scene goes even further by establishing the world through casual, unexplained jargon. When discussing Maddie, Mike mentions that cops aren't touchy-feely, and he casually suggests an intense phone call Maddie had was probably about a CI or a case. Instantly, we can infer Maddie was a police officer, and Mike likely shares that law enforcement background. And when Stacy gets too close to the truth, suspecting that Mike was the one on the phone with Maddie the night he died, Mike doesn't panic in an internal monologue, he effortlessly pivots the conversation, playing the caring elder and telling her to stop beating herself up. Through this brief conversation Mike and Stacy had, we have learned that the little girl's name is Kaylee, Mike is her grandfather, which would make Maddie his son, Stacy is Mike's daughter-in-law, Maddie's wife, and Kaylee's mother. Mike has recently relocated to Albuquerque, and that he went through a dark, messy period following his son's death, where he was absent from their lives, but has recently pulled himself together. And we know that Maddie was a police officer, and we can heavily assume that Mike was one as well. We were able to ascertain all of this simply based on the dialogue between the characters and not by the show explicitly stating it to us, which anime tends to do. In Fragrant Flower, when the writer needs to establish that Rintaro's family owns a cake shop, he just narrates that fact directly into the camera lens via his inner thoughts, as well as the fact that he's never told anybody at school about it. Why did we have to hear his thoughts about this? Is this something people usually just think to themselves? The anime could have let us figure this out through the dialogue and character interactions, but instead it just straight up tells us. Rintaro also has an internal monologue summarizing the exact academic standing of both schools and the societal hatred between each other. We don't get to deduce the prejudice, we're just handed a Wikipedia summary of the neighborhood's zoning laws. When you allow the audience to figure out the social dynamics and the character backgrounds through environmental clues and organic interactions, The world feels lived in, but most importantly, it makes you piece things together on your own, which keeps you more engaged while watching. But when a writer insists on spelling out every single societal dynamic through an internal monologue, it strips the world of its atmosphere. You're no longer experiencing a story, you're just listening to a creator read their own pitch document out loud. Exposition is another problem that anime tends to have. Exposition is basically when you explain like the history of a city or the rules of a game the characters are playing, or even a description that isn't being filtered through the character's actions and thoughts. Not only does anime often expound way too much, it also struggles with how to use exposition properly. In Mashle, Lance Crown is explaining to his classmates that there are different types of magic users: white mages, who excel at scholarship and support magic, and red mages, who excel in combat. On the surface, this might seem fine. The viewer learns something new, since we aren't too familiar with the world at this point of the series. But think about it from Lance's perspective. What reason does he have for telling his classmates this? They live in the exact same world, and this information is something that they should already know. This is an example of exposition being used poorly. Think about it this way. Imagine two real people in New York standing on the sidewalk next to the subway, and one of them says to the other, "Ah yes, the subway. The underground train network that runs on electricity and requires a metro card to access, which allows citizens to travel between the 5 boroughs." You see how ridiculous this sounds? Now, we've all heard of the old phrase of less is more, and when it comes to writing scripts for a visual medium, the direct equivalent of that is the absolute golden rule of show don't tell. Now, if you've spent any amount of time watching video essays about why anime dialogue can be so frustrating, I guarantee you've heard that exact phrase thrown around until it basically lost all meaning. But it gets repeated so obsessively because it really is the foundational bedrock of good storytelling, and it's exactly what the anime industry fundamentally struggles with. A great example of show don't tell actually appears on the TV series Shogun. Midway through the season, Toranaga delivers a piece of news to Lady Mariko in a conversation they have.
虎長様とお別れしてからの安仁様のすべての振る舞いを書き記したものにござりまする。
引き続き安仁の屋敷にとどまり通詞の役目を続けてくれ。
では主人は？
文太郎にはそなたと同じく安仁の屋敷に投留するよう申し付けた。さすれば二人のどちらにも仕えられるであろう。
He informs her that her husband, Buntaro, will be moving into the exact same house as her and the Englishman John Blackthorne. To those of you who aren't informed on the show, I'll briefly explain Mariko's position and what this means. The audience knows that Mariko's husband is abusive. We know that as far as she knew, Buntaro was allegedly killed in an ambush not too long ago. We also know that in the aftermath of that supposed death, she became romantically entangled with John Blackthorne. After this romantic entanglement, Mariko learns that her husband was in fact still alive. So you see, when Toranaga told her that Buntaro would be living with them, the audience can infer, based on Mariko's reaction, how she truly felt about this situation, without her needing to go on a monologue. The writers trust that we watched the previous episodes. They trust us to do the math on our own. If a standard anime studio directed this exact scene, we all know precisely what would happen. Time would freeze, the camera would zoom in on Mariko's violently shaking pupil, her internal monologue would immediately kick in. But if he moves into the same house as the Anjin, he might find out what we did. If he finds out, he'll kill us both. What do I do? Or something along those lines. Actually, I think I nailed that perfectly. Anyways, the script would aggressively spoon-feed the audience the exact implications of this plot point. On a different note, notice the tone of their conversation. It's somewhat stiff and deeply professional, but unlike the childhood friends in Blue Box who speak like HR representatives for absolutely no reason, the professionalism here is earned. This segues into my next gripe about anime dialogue: the flow of casual conversation, which is probably the main problem I have. There's a big structural issue with how anime characters interact on a basic interpersonal level. They often sound like aliens trying to mimic human speech, so to speak. In an anime like Blue Box, you'll have two high schoolers who have been friends for months and literally live in the same house, yet they routinely converse with the stiff, hyper-polite rigidity of middle management HR reps negotiating a corporate contract. There's no overlap in their speech or any sort of messy, casual shorthand.
Aren't you staying at the apartment?
Yeah, but I left a few things behind.
Oh, okay.
And then there was something that I wanted to say to you. You weren't there this morning.
Yes, I was. But Haru made me go on a run with him.
Haru did?
Actually, the one who wasn't there was you.
Well, I got on the wrong train by accident.
So you...
But I ran to school from the station.
I was right. We have gotten closer. Well, we'll try again tomorrow.
See you then.
Alright, let's get some direct insight into what Taiki is thinking at this moment, as if his expression and what Chinatsu said earlier doesn't already explain that. I'm sure I don't need to explain how unrealistic this conversation feels. It's almost like both of these characters are taking turns choosing a single dialogue option in a video game. Not to mention the tone of their speech is unnecessarily formal. Now you could argue that equating realistic dialogue with good dialogue is a massive fallacy. You could bring up writers like Tarantino, Sorkin, or even Shakespeare, and argue that nobody in the real world speaks in the rapid-fire, flawlessly witty, overlapping paragraphs of a Sorkin script. Nobody in the real world goes on a perfectly articulated tangent about cheeseburgers before executing someone in an apartment like in Pulp Fiction. These are examples of unrealistic dialogue as well, but most people wouldn't consider it a bad thing. Exaggeration and dramatization are quite literally the point of animation. That is correct. Stylized dialogue is fantastic. But if you defend the stiff, hyper-polite conversations between Taiki and Chinatsu by saying, well, it's just a stylistic choice, you have to ask yourself, what is that style actually achieving? Blue Box isn't some heightened, absurd crime thriller. It's not a sprawling fantasy epic. It's a grounded slice-of-life, coming-of-age romance. The entire foundation of the genre relies on emotional authenticity. We're supposed to be watching two people drop their guards, become vulnerable, and bridge the gap between them. When you have two teenagers who live in the same house and have known each other for a while and spend 20 plus episodes trying to develop their relationship, but they still speak to each other as if they were strangers, that's not an artistic stylistic choice. That's a writer who doesn't know how to write messy human intimacy, and ultimately the conversations between them become repetitive and boring. Another common defense that I'll inevitably see brought up is that it's just Japanese culture. They'll point out that Japan has a complex linguistic system of honorifics, social hierarchies, and a cultural emphasis on reading the room. And on the surface, that's a completely fair point. We are watching translated media after all. Applying Western conversational expectations to Japanese teenagers in Tokyo is a failure of media literacy. Except that defense completely falls apart the second anime leaves Japan. Let's take a look at Vinland Saga, which is a story about Vikings and is initially set mostly in England in 1013 AD. These characters are not Japanese, they aren't navigating the Tokyo school system, yet their conversations still operate on the exact same Japanese social cadences. You still have Viking warriors acting flustered, gasping in that specific anime way, over-explaining their honor, and engaging in the exact same stiff turn-based conversational structure you see in a high school rom-com.
Good morning. It's a nice day, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Good morning. It is quite lovely today.
Are you here to watch too? Go ahead. I've just finished up myself.
Oh, no. Yes, I mean, sorry. What I'm trying to say is thank you. But you can still take your time if you want. It's not like washing this face will do it any favors.
I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I think you have a handsome face. Is something wrong? Are you not feeling well?
No, just my heart.
It's not good. Are you in pain?
No, I'm fine. It's fine. I'm not sick or anything. I promise.
You watch a scene like that, and the cognitive dissonance practically gives you whiplash. I mean, you have a grown-ass Anglo-Norse Englishman reacting to a situation with the exact same emotional beat as a rom-com protagonist who just accidentally held hands with his crush. It completely shatters the immersion. I find Shogun to be a great reference to use in comparison because A, it's not an anime, and B, it takes place in Japan. Shogun is brilliant because the writing actively acknowledges how radically different cultures communicate. When the Japanese characters like Toranaga speak to one another, the dialogue is steeped in historical Japanese formality. It's entirely built on subtext, rigid politeness, and reading between the lines. But then you have John Blackthorne, the English pilot, who does not speak like them. He's brash, interrupts often, and speaks in blunt, aggressive, direct statements. The friction of the entire show comes from these two entirely different conversational styles colliding. Blackthorne doesn't magically adopt the conversational rhythm of a samurai just because he stepped foot in Japan. Now let's be fair, you could easily poke a hole in this comparison. You could argue that, of course the Englishman in Shogun sounds like a realistic Westerner, the show was run by American writers. They know exactly how an English person speaks. and the Japanese dialogue was famously overseen with meticulous detail by the lead actor and producer Hiroyuki Sanada, who essentially acted as a cultural gatekeeper to ensure absolute historical accuracy. Comparing a multi-million-dollar prestige drama equipped with a diverse writer's room and dedicated cultural consultants to a single mangaka drawing 20 pages a week in a tiny Tokyo apartment is a fundamentally unfair comparison. I admit that. The mangaka doesn't have a Western consultant sitting next to them. They have to write what they know. But while the production reality explains the problem, it doesn't excuse the final product. My issue isn't that Thorfinn and Vinland Saga fails to use historically accurate 11th century Old Norse sentence structures. I don't expect a linguistics thesis. My issue is that the default fallback for a character who is completely disconnected from modern Japanese society still has a similar social cadence of a modern Japanese teenager. When an author is tasked with writing a character from a radically different background, they have a choice. They can try to imagine how that specific harsh environment would shape a person's communication style, or they can take the easy route and just project the social dynamics of their own daily life onto a character wearing a different costume. Anime typically relies almost entirely on the latter. It really is such an incredible shame, because animation is a beautiful, entirely limitless medium for expressing surreal, abstract, and deeply intimate things that you usually wouldn't be able to capture anywhere else. When you have the absolute freedom to visually bend reality to show exactly how a character is feeling, bogging the scene down with a literal audiobook reading of their thoughts doesn't just feel lazy, it feels like a complete waste of the art form's potential. Or maybe I'm exaggerating, I don't know. Maybe I'm just being overly critical. It's entirely possible that I'm just projecting my own hyper-specific conversational preferences onto an industry that operates with a completely different set of cultural goals, and maybe expecting a 2D drawing to convey the same unspoken micro-expressions as a human actor is just asking too much of the medium. But then you see a show that actually gets it right, and you realize that it isn't impossible at all. Take Hunter x Hunter for example. And I'm not just using Hunter as an example because it's the best piece of fiction ever conceived, even though it is. I just happen to remember an interesting conversation between characters. Specifically, the scene where Gon asks Crollo a very simple question. How can you kill people who have nothing to do with you? Crollo responds,
白旗を上げた割に敵意満々といった顔だな。なぜだろうな。関係ないからじゃないか。いや、改めて問われると答えがたいものだな。動機の言語化か。あまり好きじゃないしな。しかし案外、いや、やはりと言うべきか。自分をつかむ鍵はそこにあるか。
Now you might be thinking,
What's he talking about?
Or you might be thinking, wait, isn't he just monologuing about his feelings? Isn't that what you were complaining about? But the reason this scene is a masterpiece of writing is because Crollo isn't delivering an exposition dump, he's actively trying and failing to figure out his own psychology in real time. This is also an example of stylized dialogue which I talked about earlier. Sure, it's unrealistic for someone to actually talk this way, but it actually achieves something here. Crollo is a deeply damaged, sociopathic human being trying to untangle a complex web of cognitive dissonance, and the dialogue reflects that struggle perfectly. By having Crollo stumble over his words and fail to give a clear, definitive answer, the writing reveals the terrifying, hollow core of his character far more effectively than a 10-minute flashback ever could. It proves that when anime characters are allowed to actually think rather than just narrate, the medium is capable of writing some of the most sophisticated, nuanced dialogue in modern fiction. Yes, I'm glazing. On the topic of masterfully written dialogue, Arcane is certainly not something we can exclude. One line that comes to mind is when Silco is sitting down in front of Vander's statue and he says, "Oh, it all makes sense now, brother. Is there anything so undoing as a daughter?" When you really sit down and map out Silco's entire character arc, the sheer weight of this scene becomes almost overwhelming, mostly because his entire ideology, his whole violent, single-minded pursuit of an independent Zaun, was built on the deep resentment he felt toward Vander for giving up that exact same dream. For his entire life, Silco believed that real power belonged only to those who would stop at nothing to achieve it, making him completely incapable of understanding how a man as fierce as his brother could just abandon his revolution. But then he takes in Jinx, and over the years, as he grows to care for her as if she were his own daughter, we watch him slowly make the exact same mistakes that Vander made. Jinx constantly jeopardizes his empire. Her chaotic actions cause massive problems for his political position, and yet he still endlessly defends her, blinding himself to the fact that his underlings can actively see him slipping as a leader. It isn't until Jace forces his hand, offering him his life's dream of an independent nation on a silver platter, on the condition that he has to hand over Jinx, that Silco finally realizes how much he's changed. He realizes that he's fully willing to abandon the one goal he devoted his entire bloody life to just to protect this girl, and in that agonizing moment, he finally understands why Vander hung up his gloves all those years ago. The brilliant part about the line, "Is there anything so undoing as a daughter?" isn't just the subtext, the fact that he's officially surrendering his political empire without ever having to actually say the words "I surrender." It's the deeply tragic irony of the specific word the writers chose to use. The word undoing is a polysemy, which means it contains multiple meanings. When Silco says it, he simply means it in the emotional sense, that the tyrant he thought he was has been undone and completely changed by fatherhood. But the writers are playing a much darker, much more fatalistic trick on the audience, because undoing also means literal ruin and destruction. The script is quietly utilizing dramatic irony to foreshadow his downfall, which is that Jinx is quite literally going to kill him and be his undoing. When we talk about dramatic irony, we're really just talking about an asymmetry of information. The incredible, suffocating tension that gets created when the audience knows something that the characters on screen do not. If you want to create a genuinely suspenseful scene, the absolute best way to do it is to give the audience a crucial piece of information and then force them to sit there and watch two characters engage in a completely normal, mundane conversation, totally unaware of the impending disaster. The tension doesn't come from the words they're saying, it comes entirely from the gap between what the characters know and what the audience knows. Keep the audience a little ahead of the characters or a little behind. Now imagine a scene where we see a villain slip poison into a drink before handing it to the hero. If a typical anime studio directed this scene, we'd instantly get an internal monologue from the villain. Heh, sorry man, but the juice I gave you contains a powerful laxative. One sip and your guts will be on a non-stop roller coaster for 3 days. Now you might think I'm just building up a ridiculous, exaggerated strawman argument to make anime look bad. But this exact literal scenario plays out in the very first phase of the Hunter exams in Hunter x Hunter. Tompa, a veteran exam taker who we don't know anything else about, walks up to our three completely naive protagonists and generously offers them some perfectly innocent looking cans of orange juice to celebrate their arrival. We have no clue that he could potentially be messing with them, but don't worry about that, his monologue will catch us right up to speed, and just reveal his entire plan to us. Technically, this is more about how anime hates letting us figure things out, and it is a form of dramatic irony because the monologue does successfully create a gap in knowledge between us and the protagonist, and I guess by the definition of the term, you would be right. We know about the laxative and Gon doesn't. But the problem here isn't the presence of the irony, it's the absolute laziness of the delivery mechanism. When you build dramatic irony organically, like showing a shot of Tompa slipping a vial of liquid into the cans while his back is turned, the tension is born entirely from the silence of the visual. You're letting the audience discover the danger for themselves, but when you forcefully pause the scene to have the villain explicitly explain the mechanics of the trap through an internal monologue, it completely destroys the real-time pacing of the moment. It turns what should be a highly suspenseful life-or-death psychological game into a heavily narrated tutorial sequence. It's the equivalent of a magician stopping his own show to loudly explain how the trap door works before the trick is even finished, and it just proves that the anime industry would rather spoon-feed you the plot than actually let you feel the suspense or figure it out for yourself. The most ironic part about this is that by dedicating so much unnecessary screen time to his internal thoughts, the show accidentally telegraphs the outcome of the scene before it even happens. When an anime artificially slows down time just so a villain can loudly gloat in his own head for 30 seconds, it becomes incredibly obvious to the viewer that Gon is obviously going to figure it out and spit the drink out anyway. See guys, I'm not biased. Even Hunter x Hunter isn't infallible. Now I know some of you are already coming to the conclusion that, so good dialogue is just no dialogue? If a scene is obviously showing us a visual representation of how a character is feeling, including their inner thoughts adds absolutely nothing to it. It makes it feel completely redundant, turning what should be a raw, intimate moment into something that feels more like a mandatory audio description track for an audience the director assumes just isn't paying attention. And maybe I am completely off base here. I know that adapting a manga is a wildly different beast with its own unique pacing, and perhaps it's arrogant of me to sit here and demand that an industry strip away one of its most deeply ingrained stylistic traditions just because I personally find it exhausting to be constantly spoon-fed the plot. But when an industry is quite literally built on the backs of visual artists who can convey an entire lifetime of regret just by the way they draw a character's eyes dropping to the floor, forcing those characters to constantly narrate their own tragedy out loud doesn't just ruin the tension, it actively insults the art. Sometimes the absolute best thing a script can possibly do is just stop talking.